So David, you spoke about the task of the translator last night, and I was wondering if you could sort of look at the other side of your work and perhaps make this conversation in part about the task of the biographer. I just said I've been having a lot of fun reading your biographies over the last few weeks, especially the Romain Gary biography, which is a writer I hadn't heard of, but lived this kind of really incredible life and wrote an immense number of books in, it seems like, wildly different genres and modes. And so I wonder if we could sort of maybe start by maybe talking about where you begin when you start a biography like that. I mean, obviously you've probably read the work, but how do you go from the interest in the work to wanting to undertake this huge project?
Well, thank you for mentioning my book on Romain Gary. Of the 3 biographies I've written, it took me the longest, and it is the least read, and it's not even available in bookshops in the US of A, and it's not been translated into French. Poor old Romain Gary. I mean, each of the 3 that I've written really come from different impulses, different prompts, and actually different needs. And so if you start at the end, Romain Gary is the last, is the 3rd of them, and probably the last I'll ever write. A narrative biography of Gary exists in French, an extremely long, poorly written, but extremely well documented biography by Myriam Anisimov. So I did not need to do that work again.
Right.
Whereas the Perec biography, which I wrote 20 years before, there was nothing in print about Perec, and that was what you might call, in quote marks, the heroic phase, where I had to go and meet people, find documents, haul it out. So the Gary is, as it were, closer to an essay about Romain Gary, cast in the form of a biography, whereas the Perec is much more an actual narrative of a life that was up to that point really not known, and indeed not known because it was so diverse and varied to the people he mixed with, who only knew bits of it. Also, of course, Gary is a much older generation, and the vast majority of his contemporaries were not alive when I was doing research. Perec, on the other hand, died young, and I was doing the research 20 years earlier, so the vast majority of his contemporaries were still alive. So they're 2 very different kinds of projects. What prompted me to undertake the life of Gary, well, like so many things in life, in my life anyway, it's suddenly realizing I'd missed the boat. I had read Gary when he was Émile Ajar, when he was famous under a pseudonym, and I hadn't really thought about, I mean, the Ajar novels are terribly funny, and I love that sort of play with language, but that was that. And it was only 20 years later that I read something by Larry Kritzman that prompted me to reread the Ajar. And I found them even more fascinating than before. And I thought, well, I really ought to find out about the other guy he was, his other pseudonym. So I started reading the works of Romain Gary, published under the name Romain Gary. And at that distance, and sort of and looking backwards, a kind of coherence, kind of corresponded. And it seemed to me more and more incredible that when he was writing under a pseudonym, nobody guessed who he was, because the correspondences between the 2 are so obvious. It's actually in your face. You just have to know French, English, German, Russian, and Yiddish, which I do up to a point. And I so that's why I thought, I really have to do something with this. Gary has remained widely read in France. All his books are in paperback. He was very famous in the United States from around 1952 through to the Ajar affair and its revelation after his death in 1981, at which point American publishers just dropped him. There's a stupid sensitivity in the Anglophone world to questions of fraud inauthenticity, cheating, and so forth. They just dropped it. It went out of print, and nobody's heard of him since then. So I thought I would be his new champion and reopen those doors. And so parallel to writing the biography, I knocked on many doors and told many publishers they should really bring it out again. And a total failure. Three of his books do remain in print with new directions, and I'm very glad to say that his last, and in many ways most beautiful book, Les Cerfs-Volants, The Kites, will be appearing in English translation probably next year. Not translated by me, but I've been involved in getting that going. So hope springs eternal. There may be a rebirth of Gary as a writer in English. So there we are. That's how that one went. But that accounts also for the structure of my book, where you see, which is not straightforwardly chronological narrative, in that the story of his life is so spectacular that just to tell it sounds rather like cheating. So I've mixed it up together with essays about how to read him.
Well, I mean, I think one of the, I often think that people think, oh, nonfiction's easy. You just have the stuff, you just have to write it, right? It's sort of like saying to a sculptor, like, well, here's a block of stone, you know what a man looks like, so it's easy, right? But so one of the immense challenges of writing sort of any nonfiction work is, what do you do with all this material? And it's interesting to hear you describe the Romain Gary book as an essay, because it does have very sort of carefully threaded motifs through it. One of which is the play on the Wilsonian person's right to self-determination, which Gary sort of translated as person's right to dispose of himself.
That's right.
It's
the official French translation of the Wilsonian principle of Versailles, of the right of self-determination. Is in French, it's le droit des peuples de disposer d'eux-mêmes, because autodétermination means something completely different. And Gary, as a foreign language learner of French, also as a speaker of English from the age of 30 onwards, heard that and reinterpreted himself as the right of people, rather than peoples, to dispose of themselves. Something that really, it meant something deep to him, because his mother, he was a late child. His mother was quite an old woman when he was a teenager and a grown man. And she was also very ill. She was a diabetic. And he saw just what kind of a decline that meant. And he formed the idea really quite young that he would never want to be in that state, and that he had the right to dispose of himself at the time when he decided. And that's why interpretations of Gary's suicide as an act of depression, or this or that or the other, are slightly beside the point. That it's in his writing and self-defined identity from 30 years before that he had the right to dispose of himself as everybody else did.
I guess I'm asking because that seems like one of the spines of the book, and maybe also a very complex idea about translation. That Gary is this sort of living embodiment of the idea of translation. That he, not only sort of moved between languages, translated his own works from French to English and English back to French, but also translated into himself an entirely
No, he never translated himself from English back to French, which is quite interesting. He always at least had a prête-nom, somebody else who did a plain prose version. Often credited, but not always, and sometimes credited under the wrong name. But there was always somebody else who did the prose version from English back into French, and then he rewrote it in French. So the French editions of his English novels are actually rather different from the English novels. Whereas the other way around, from French into English, several of them he just translated himself into English. Under various false names. The best one is John Markham Beach, because there's a place in California called Markham Beach. He used to go stay in a hotel there, so he calls himself John Markham Beach.
So how long did it take you to form the book around various ideas that structure it? I mean, obviously you start with a massive research, but then you sort of winnow down into something that has a story, that has ideas that it traces. Could you tell us about that?
Well, the Gary was the longest. The Gary, I think I started that in the early 2000s. I finished it around 2007, and then there was the Great Crisis, and Random House nearly collapsed, and they deferred everything. So it didn't actually appear till 2010, but it was finished, I think, summer of 2007. It took me six years or so.
Okay.
You say, the Gary, because it was an immortal theme, I sort of felt that I was writing, this is the last book I'm ever going to write. And I don't particularly want to finish writing it because, but I felt that with many books I've written. Really, this is the last time I'm doing this. And so that it sort of spreads. The Perec, on the other hand, although it's a much longer book, and there's much more, I should say, material research went into it, it was done rather quickly. It was the first one I did. I had generous financing from publishers were then quite flush with money and paid for a research assistant. And I traipsed all around the place. I went to Brisbane in Australia and Sarajevo and Belgrade and so forth, because all the people were still alive, they were still there. How do you organize the material? Well, if you do, I mean, that's the problem. One absolutely, well, for me, indispensable thing in this kind of literary biographical writing is chronology. It's not because, well, because chronology if you get the things really in the right order, get the dates right, then certain interpretations are ruled out, because life is lived forward, not backwards. So it gives you a spine, a structure. You don't have to tell it in that order. But with the Perec, actually, with my research assistant, we did a huge wall chart about this size to get the dates and the thing and put them in their right places. Again, they're different projects, but with the Perec, of course, which is based very largely on interviews with living people, I just felt I had to take a kind of self-denying ordinance that I would use no piece of information that had not been provided to me by two people or more. That's to say, bits and bobs that I had just from one source, I'd sort of put on one side. Not because those people were necessarily lying, but because there were so many disagreements among people about what happened when and there. Unless I had some kind of corroboration, I didn't feel I could rely on it. Now, obviously, with more historical subjects, or with you're writing biographies situated further in the past, you can't always have that. But given that I guess I spoke to about 130, 140 different people about Georges Perec, there was enough mass of stuff there to still leave enough to tell a story. Right. An added difficulty with the Perec, which was not true with the Tati or the Gary, was that because Perec died young, because people were still quite sore about it, because there were rival appropriations at the emotional and family and literary levels, some people would give me information and said, but I don't want you to attribute it to me.
Oh, interesting.
And I thought, well, how can I do that? And the way that I eventually did it was by not footnoting anything directly, but just gathering together at the end of each chapter the names of the people on whose testimony that chapter was based. They hated it. But at the same time, I couldn't do it the other way in a more classically academic way and attribute statements to individual people, except some statements I would say be private by somebody who wishes to remain nameless. That you can't do. Or that would have been even wilder if I'd done that. So the procedure was to spend some time with a person who'd known Perec, had things to tell me. I did not use a tape recorder. I thought that was too intrusive. Also, it takes a long time to transcribe, what with dinner table conversation and clatter and everything. So immediately after the conversation, I would go back to my hotel room and write it all down, and then go back to Manchester and type it up, and then send it to the person and ask them to correct it. And it's very interesting what you got back. It's really very interesting. Sometimes they'll just put a line through it and say, you've understood nothing. But sometimes, of course, seeing your own words in written form, acts as like a kind of a vacuum cleaner. Or, I mean, they say, but now I remember something. And I get these palimpsests back with comments, and they are really fabulously valuable things. That's to say, bits of memory that probably would not have been prompted by anything other than seeing their own words in print. And then, sorting it all out along the great tapeworm of chronology and seeing what kind of sense it made, and then just reading and rereading and rereading Perec's own works. So that's that kind of biography writing. The Tati, which comes in the middle, is a kind of intermediate project because Tati's daughter, Sophie, had kept all the paperwork that there was. Not that there was a great deal, because Tati was, well, he wasn't actually illiterate, but I mean, he didn't write things. He wasn't a man who pen. And he didn't really write letters very much, did things on the telephone. But still, what documentation there was with Sophie, and so were the cans of film and some of the original stuff. And I made it quite clear I wasn't going to write what's called an authorized biography. I didn't want her permission, but she did give me a lot of assistance, so that I was in her debt, in a sense, for the actual material. And what was awkward was, for me, the mystery of Jacques Tati is, how does a guy like that come to make films like that? In actual life, Tati seems to have been rather dim, to put it mildly, clumsy, a bit oafish. I mean, the most he ever read was the sports page of Le Figaro. No, I'm serious. That's the most he ever read. I think he ever read a book. He had no musical talent. He had no artistic talent. If it hadn't been for the camera, he would not have been able to express himself. Yeah. With the camera, it's so incredibly intelligent and sophisticated and fine and refined. And it's a lesson in humility, really, because I've grown up, no doubt you have, thinking that smartness equals being smart with words or numbers. And Tati was smart with neither, but he was smart in another way, almost like an alien to me. And there are other ways of being smart. And of course, Sophie, his daughter, didn't really twig. I mean, wasn't on that wavelength. She was a very dutiful and submissive daughter, whose whole life was to maintain the flame. So that was a source of some diplomatic difficulty too.
Yeah, I mean, you must have, when you're talking to hundreds of people, you said 140 people for Perec?
For Perec, yeah, around that.
I mean, you must get sometimes wildly different accounts of what happened. So how do you parse that? Or is it a matter of saying, well, this seems to be true?
It wasn't so much different accounts of what happened. It was accounts of different things that happened. For example, Perec's involvement in experimental German radio plays, which he didn't talk about to his other French friends, who were flabbergasted to discover that he was a famous radio playwright in Germany. And they said, no, it's not true, he did it for the money. No. Or his engagement with these Yugoslav art historians, and that whole patch of his life in the 1950s, and his stay in Belgrade and Sarajevo, which he never talked about to anybody else. And people said, no, you've invented that. That's a lot of nonsense. I mean, Perec was in Paris. No, he wasn't. He was in Belgrade. It was that Perec led a quite compartmentalized life, and the friends that he had, and there were very many, mostly only knew about some of those compartments and not the others. So that what I got as comeback was that this isn't a Perec we knew. This is Bellos' Perec, not mine.
Right, right.
And in a way, I'm very glad that they are a little bit shocked and alarmed, or were at the time, because that's exactly the service I was giving them. There are conflicting interpretations rather than accounts of the way he related to his adoptive family, and their family relations are things about which people have different interpretations and memories. There are conflicting interpretations of his relations with women, again, as you would expect. But on the narrative of his life, of what he did, it wasn't so much different accounts of the same thing as accounts of different things that people hadn't known how that they were related or put together. With Tati, it's a little different. There are sides of Tati's life that are quite obscure and that will no doubt remain so, because he made 6 feature films in a long life, and in between them, he didn't seem to do very much. But maybe he did. I mean, there are areas where, because there's no correspondence to speak of, and because he was a mumbler and he wasn't a very verbal guy, who knows what he was doing when he wasn't making those. Probably just sitting by the beach or something, but maybe. With Romain Gary, that's such an extraordinarily active, multiple life, with so many pseudonyms in different languages. It's perfectly possible there are works by Gary under other pseudonyms that haven't been identified. Done a certain amount of searching, but in a sense it's quite futile. I mean, how would you? Maybe one will come across them one day. So that's a possibility that can't be closed off by any amount of biographical research with a person of that kind, because he wrote very fast and he wrote in many languages, and he was for inventing new pseudonyms and identities. So there may be other Romain Garys hovering somewhere.
Well, just one more question for me, and then I guess we should turn out to anyone else who has questions. But one of the other strange things about nonfiction is that it, unlike a novel where the characters don't really exist past the last page, in nonfiction books there are people still connected to the book who do exist, and so they may bring new information to you, the biographer, after the book is finished. There may be new things that come to light that cast parts of the things you've written in a different light. And maybe you could talk about, I mean, you mentioned last night learning something about Romain Gary that actually seems to cast his suicide in kind of a different light. And so that's just an odd thing about nonfiction that you can't really control. So what are your thoughts about that? And would you ever, if something quite dramatic was added to your knowledge, would you go back and revise a biography?
That's an issue about which I've thought quite a bit. And I've come to a view on. Of course, while you're writing it, and for a while after you've published it, because you're still in the dynamic of trying to find out everything, you keep thinking, well, I'll just rewrite it one last time, or I'll make those changes. Make it definite and do it. And yes, I mean, that's a natural impulse, is to want to carry on writing the book, to hanging on to it. In the case of Perec, obviously, since I published the book in 1993, a great deal of reading and working over Perec has gone on since then, and no doubt if I were writing the book today, I would start in a somewhat different place. But I've come to the conclusion that actually part of what's valuable about a book, that book or a book, is that it is an index of the moment at which it was written. And that becomes, as time goes by, that becomes more and more part of its value. That's what could be known about Perec in 1993. And now I have been asked to do a revised edition, and I have hummed and hawed and dragged my heels, and I think I'm going to say absolutely not. That book remains what it's, just as chronology is the washing line on which you can hang the stuff and make some kind of sense of it. So the book is itself part of a chronology of my life and of everybody else's. It's a book of 1993. Sure, we can correct the typos or silly things like that, but actually revising it in the light of today's night, that's for somebody else to do. That's my feeling. But I mean, it is something of a drama at different points when you realize you've just learned something, and had you known that then you, etc. But when a sufficient number of decades have gone past, you realize, well, that's inevitable, and that's what it has to be. And anyway, I've donated all the paperwork, all my notes and everything to a library in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm not going to go back and look at them.
Well, to anyone who has questions.
Hello.
My name is Tracy, and I'm a student of Princeton Social Thought. I've got two questions, maybe you can choose one. So my first question is biography something that's sort of always in the background of your interest as a literary scholar in general? I mean, obviously you must have started working on because you were working on their books, but is this something that you're generally interested in when you read books or when you write about them?
Right, I'll answer that question. What's your second question? Okay, doesn't matter. I got the answer is no, not at all. Not at all. The Perec biography arose because I'd translated La Vie Mode d'Emploi, and people kept asking me, you know, who is this guy? And I said, I don't know. So they said, go and find out, or can you, you know. So I mean, it arose as a consequence of a reading, and not as a way into the reading. Writing about Tati arose from going to see a remastered copy of Playtime on the big screen. I'd never actually seen Playtime on the big screen before, and being absolutely bowled over, and going to the library and looking up all there was on Jacques Tati and discovering there wasn't anything very good, and I can do better than that. Gary is a little different, as I've already explained. It was the rediscovery of him through Ajar. It seemed to me then, and I'm not sure whether it's true now, but I hope so. Well, perhaps it would be nice if it weren't. But that, you know, by the 1980s, 1990s, writing, as it were, critical interpretive works about writers or movies reached a very small audience, and especially for Perec, but also for Tati. I wanted to be talking to the readership, or the potential readership, of his work. And the literary biography at that time was one way of doing it. In fact, probably the only way of doing it, short of making a movie. But as you know, for every 100 movies made, only one actually gets shown. So that I saw literary biography as perhaps one of the last remaining levers with which to have a kind of audience for literature. And one thing led to another, so I wrote 3 of them, but they're actually connected, the 3 of them. But when I read a book, no, I'm not especially interested in the author.
My other question is, I seem to remember you're working on a book about a long 19th century novel, and that's still the case. And I was wondering whether you think about a book on the lives and afterlives of a book as a type of biography.
Well, with Les Misérables, which is the one you're referring to, autobiography has to come into it, because Victor Hugo made Les Misérables so long because he wanted to put in everything, and everything, of course, is mostly everything Victor Hugo, since he's that sort of a guy. And to understand what's going on in Les Misérables, I would say fully, but you know, adequately, you have to understand both the explicit and the hidden reenactment of various important bits of his own life. Some of it's very explicit, some of it's quite hidden through the plot of numbers and dates and things. But that said, I'm actually more interested in Les Misérables as I'm more interested in reading Les Misérables through what it has become, I mean, through the history of its cultural reception. Since it's now much more than the name of just a novel, and I don't mean to refer to the musical alone, because the musical is just an epiphenomenon on the side of an enormous international, global cultural reception. So I will be writing about, I mean, with help from other people, about what happened to it in China, what happened to it in Russia, and so forth. And insofar as I can discover tiny little traces of it, the very first musical performance of Les Misérables, which was in Yiddish in Vilna in 1925. Yeah.
You've been a champion of less heralded foreign literature and the need for an audience, that observing audience. And after your remarks last night, I went to read your introduction for the recent Kadari translation of Eastern Gods, and it's astonishingly beautiful. In 5 or 6 pages, it is a bridge, a transition to the reader who may be unfamiliar with the context. And I'd like to, I'd be curious if we need more of these sorts of short, concise, insightful introductions to make less accessible foreign literature more accessible.
I have, as usual, self-contradictory views on that. With some novels, like Life Used Manual, I felt it was completely inappropriate to put a preface and introduction that it has to be read as it is, and it either sinks or swims for what it is. I don't want to make it look like a classic already, or a dutiful thing I have to learn the data. And most of the novels I've translated from French are like that. They just stand on their own, and they either sink or swim. The Cadere, it's about half and half, because Albania is a very, is not widely known. Most people don't even quite sure where it is. And this is an Albanian novel about Moscow 60 years ago, and I felt that an introduction was more helpful than not. But it's a judgment call each time, and editors and publishers don't always agree with each other, always me. So what actually happens isn't entirely predictable. But I hope you appreciate that in the case of some novels, it really would not be doing them a favor to put an introduction. It really would be presenting them as a type of object that you really don't want them to be yet. You want to be just read like books, and enjoyed. But I'm glad you like my introduction. That book has waited a long time to appear in English. It was one of the, once Cadere got underway in the early 1990s, it was one of the novels I said has to appear in English. And it was decades before the publisher said, yes, all right. But I actually translated it 5 years ago. It's been waiting that long to come out.
And I just wonder if your experience as a kind of translator informed in some way, your work as a biographer in capturing spirit and mode and truth and fact.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really thought about it that way. Obviously, my work as translator and biographer are intimately linked, because it started with Perec, and also the bizarre fact that I've only written biographies of foreign writers, and therefore all the quotation of original material and so forth in my biographies is in translation. And so that when my books are translated back into French, in fact, there's a certain amount of massaging has to go on, and the French editions are not the same as English editions. So that's where, for me, the sort of translator-biographer thing meshes and merges. I mean, in the strictly narrative part, I mean, biography is not strictly a narrative art. I mean, it is a narrative, but there's much more to it than that. And what's the most interesting part of it is not the narrative part, but the reflective or analytical, or the making sense or connecting up with larger things. In an odd way, I feel less entitled to embroider or omit or add than I do as a translator, because there are actual people. And as a translator, I'm playing with things that are actually, in principle, more malleable, more flexible. But in all kinds of writing, non-fiction or fiction, translation or not translation, we're always confronted with both the inadequacy of language and with its indeterminacy, that things, you can't actually ever get to the bottom of it.
A couple of years ago, I heard a woman who's Japanese who translates from English into Japanese, actually from English and French. And she said that she reads the text and she lets it float in her mind until she can feel the text in a Japanese context.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, then she feels ready to begin translating. And I love the imagery, but I wondered if it's because the cultures are so alien, or if that also felt similar to process for you.
I wouldn't have described it like that, but I have nothing but admiration for my colleagues who work in languages or other cultures that are very distant from each other, because after all, English and French are awfully close. They've had 1,000 years of common history and common culture, and they talk largely about the same thing. And sometimes they get really, I still think English is really just a dialect of French anyway, and I'm not doing anything very important. And then, then you encounter something and you think quite the opposite, that my God, with 1,000 years of history, and that English channel is still there, and they really are, incommensurable. I don't know. It's a bit like driving on the left and driving on the right. It used to be a great effort to change one to the other. I have to sort of think about it for several days. Right? But I don't know. I just got sort of inured to it now, and I switch back and forth without notice. It's become an automatism. I hope this is not sort of tempting fate, and the next time I reverse out the garage, turn the wrong way. But yes, I feel that in my particular personal case, no, I don't feel the need to sort of re-bathe myself in a foreign culture. I'm a bit more like a circus performer. I know when to put this nose on or that nose on, without thinking about it too hard. Yeah. But to Japanese and Hungarian and things like that, it's really a much more extensive and sophisticated mental operation. It must be. Yes.
So you said that the Ismail Kadare novel waited a long time. This most recent one waited a long time to appear in English,
Mm-hmm.
and I got the impression that this is something that should have appeared. That you wanted for it to have a larger audience.
Yeah.
Can you name, or maybe not, any other current authors that haven't been translated or you think have not been translated enough that we should seek out?
Oof. There's a great Hungarian novelist called Miklós Szentkuti, whom I have not read because he's not been translated, but I would like to read him. So there's one. Well, by definition, I don't know who they are because they haven't been translated. Well, I'm very disappointed with French literature of the past 30 years there aren't that many books I've read in French that I would really want to see translated. And I can't for the moment think of any except one that hasn't been, and that is the first of the novels that Romain Gary published under the pseudonym of Émile Ajar. That's never been translated, and that would be rather fun to do, but there's no point doing it until somehow Romain Gary gets a bit more of a head of steam in the English-speaking world, and people then have a reason for reading a thing by an author not called Romain Gary, but Émile Ajar. But no, I mean, you know, I've read some really quite good French books by Yasmina Reza and Lydie Salvert. They have been translated, and they've not had much impact, but they're there in English translation. I do recommend them. I mean, the flow of translations into English, people grumble about this. They say, oh, less than 3% of books published in English are translations. It's true. But the English book system is extremely large. I mean, the US publishes 288,000 new titles a year, and the UK another 140,000, which overlap. They're not by no means all the same books. And 3% of that is a lot of books. It's true that in France, something between 15 and 20% of books published are in translation. But France only publishes 45 to 50,000 books a year, and so 15% of that is no more. And the vast majority of those books are middle-brow and lower in English pulp fiction that doesn't really matter whether it gets translated or not. So the balance is not as bad as it looks from the sheer numbers in terms of works of merit and interest moving back and forth. And I think most of the literary works of real interest that I've come across in the past few decades have, in French, have ended up in English. So, there we are.
This is a question I wanted to ask you last night, because it's about translation. But when you were talking about seminal,
Mm-hmm.
and you were talking about the 1930s setting, and I wondered when you're translating how much you feel you're obliged to bring things up to date, presumably to some extent just to make them comprehensible, but or do you feel that you should retain the period flavor of what you're translating?
Well, two answers to that. In terms of the world to which the text refers, no, in my view, it would be quite wrong to bring it up to date. Mm-hmm. You know, the objects, the realia, however obscure they are. I remember one in that seminal novel. He's on a pier, a jetty, and it's dark, and the fishermen are bringing in their herring catch, illuminated by lampe à carbure. Whatever is a lampe à carbure? I haven't been able to buy a lampe à carbure for 50 or 100 years. And, you know, so you go back, and not into contemporary dictionaries, but you have to have a set of old dictionaries and old reference works, and eventually find out that what it was, and its English name then was acetylene lamp. Now, nobody knows what an acetylene lamp is. We all think oxyacetylene lamp, which of course is a thing you now use for soldering. Yeah, it's a high pressure thing. Whereas an acetylene lamp is something quite different. That is its word name in 1931. And I know readers are going to misunderstand. Hard luck. But I can't change it. Well, I could, you see. The way you change that sort of thing is just, you don't modernize it, but you just go up in generalization. You use the hyperonym. So floodlight. Yeah? And you don't need to say exactly what kind of floodlight. Yeah? So you can remove some elements of obscurity, obsolescence, just by going one or two steps up in generalization, which is also elucidation. But that's not the question as it's understood by my colleagues in translation studies or people like Pivera and Valachonskaya in their translations of the Russian classics, where they claim that it would be wrong to use in a present-day translation of a work from the 19th century any words of English that have only come into English since then. Yeah? And it sounds logical, but when you think about it, it's completely balmy. First of all, how do you know? And you know, dictionaries are wonderful, wonderful things, but their databases are only very approximate in terms of when a word is first attested in the English language, because it depends what database they're using, whether it's the Collins Cobold or Trésor de la langue française. So it's going to be a fuzzy judgment, even however scholarly you are, it's fuzzy. Secondly, you're depriving yourself of a whole range of English, because the logical thing to add to that, and I'm going to use all the words that were current in 1857. Aha. In other words, you're going to write pastiche of 19th century English, but you can't do that. Pastiche is only pastiche. It's not real. And who is there around now to tell you whether you've got it right? So I sweep all that away, and I think, no, you write in your language. The only language that you command completely is the language that you command, which is your language. And you take out of it things that are outrageously and plainly and obviously anachronistic. And you know, Anna Karenina is not going to tread on a piece of chewing gum, right? You know, literally or linguistically, you smooth that out. But I think to pretend that you are not using any words that Anna Karenina wouldn't have known in English had she been speaking English at the time is it's a piece of posturing. I mean, it can't be true. You can't do it. And Piver and Walachonska don't do it either, because it would read extremely odd. So that's my answer about modernization. I mean, inevitably you make mistakes. Of course, you sometimes get the judgment call wrong, and you sometimes get really surprised to learn retrospectively that words you've used really are very recent, or meant something different 50 years ago. So there's all that margin of error, but your aim should be to leave the world that's described as it is with the correct words for it, and where that won't do, then just to generalize a bit and to use the language that is your language today.
Can you talk about your experience working with Perec's unfinished novel, 53 Days?
Mm.
And if that was any kind of like collaborative effort, because there's other editors there?
Mm.
And then more generally, I guess if translation is ever at all collaborative, or if it's more solitary?
All writing is collaborative. Would you agree? There's always an editor, or someone else, somebody over the breakfast table. No, you need echo and come back. I'm very grateful to all my editors, even when they were wrong, because without that to and fro, back and forth, or to and fro, you really don't know where you are at. 53 Days is special. I'm glad to say it will be back in print this summer. It's the novel that Perec was writing at the time of his death. It's a detective story. It's an extremely complicated, mysterious detective story, of which I think 13 chapters were in pre-final draft. So they were typed up, but it was obvious that there was going to be some more editing before the... and the remainder of the novel, part 2 of the novel, existed in notes and scraps. We know which chapters they belong to because he kept things in manila files, chapter by chapter. Now that was put together and edited by Harry Matthews and Jacques Roubaud after Perec's death. They found a way of making it a readable book, but translating it is a complete nightmare. The one thing that you do when you translate, that you cannot avoid doing when you translate, is to raise it stylistically up a notch or two. I mean, you're trying to write good English, because if you write bad English, you'll just be told you can't write. So how do you represent in English the unfinishedness of a not fully edited original? It's more impossible. I mean, so it reads a bit more smoothly in English than it does in French. I just didn't know how to not do that. It was collaborative. I mean, I talked to Jacques and Harry about it, and it was very collaborative in the sense that they actually disagreed. Jacques Roubaud said, well, Harry thinks he knows what the solution to the mystery is, but he's wrong. And Harry said, oh, I had this inspiration, and Jacques doesn't understand. And of course, Harry could have translated in English himself, and so could Jacques Roubaud, incidentally, who's a great French poet, but in written English, he's thoroughly as fluent as I am, and he probably knows more words as well, because he knows about so many different things. I don't know. It was in working on that translation that a graduate student of mine discovered a key that Jacques and Harry and I had missed, and that is the. You obviously have read the book. You know it. Yeah. There's a one point where the detective is given a tip-off that Serval, the mysterious man who's disappeared and who's left a detective novel unfinished at his death, had actually copied out one chapter from another book, except that he'd substituted 12 letter words for 12 other 12 letter words. Yeah. Oh yes, I put it into my book, yeah. This is me showing off. But a student of mine realized that, because Perec then lays them out, 12 by 12 letter grid, side by side, and says, and the detective says, like, I stared at them for ages, but I couldn't see, and it couldn't make any sense of it, and that's that. Whereas my student came in and said, there's an acrostic in it. It says La Chartreuse, down across the line. Wow! Yes, well, obviously, because La Chartreuse is both the name of a novel by Stendhal, and Stendhal provides many of the names in 53 Days, Grianta, and all sorts of things. And you suddenly begin to see kind of Stendhalian intertext appearing that doesn't actually solve all the problems, it begins to make a little bit of sense. So there, collaborative, my word, yes. A grad student, me, Harry, Jacques Perec, and so the interaction of different people is very much part of the job, yes.
Could we continue on that episode for a moment? Because you inscribed yourself into the
Yep.
trip.
Yep.
Could you talk? So the translator there was becoming, I don't know, more than a detective, a criminal.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, they were. Yeah, there I took a terrible liberty, but nobody noticed for 20 years, so I feel free to talk about it now. Obviously, having had that pointed out to me by my grad student, and having checked it with Harry and Jacques, and they said, how do we miss it? Obviously, I had to do something about it in English and rejuggle the English so that you get the same acrostic on the one side. And that involved rewriting a little bit the story from which it had been copied, so that the words fit in grammatically and are not too absurd in their original position. But you've got two 12-letter groups, yeah? The ones that have been changed and that make La Chartreuse, and the ones that haven't been changed, which don't make anything at all in the French. So I thought, well, if I can do that, I can do something else. And I rearranged the others so that it has a diagonal acrostic that says, DB done it. And of course, nobody noticed. Nobody noticed for years and years and years, and I kept it to myself and let the cat out of the bag in that book. So obviously, it makes no difference whatsoever to the reading experience, but that's all right. It's like sort of writing in invisible ink. But no, that's not collaborative. That's crime. But I think, Yeah, Bellos done it. That's right. I think what it shows to me is that when you have a really hard constraint to meet, once you get yourself into that mindset that enables you to do the first side, you can then do more. You really do, you acquire kind of little literary muscles that you didn't know you had. And so it's nice to go on using them, to go on a bit longer. That happens with Gilbert Adair's translation of Perec's lipogrammatic novel, the one that it's called Avoid in English. It doesn't have the letter E in it. Because to write without the letter E, you sort of train yourself and you get used to it and you start thinking, you know, go to a McDonald's but not to a Burger King. And, you live it so as to get to it. And then once you've got yourself into that mindset and you translate Perec, you feel, I can do more. And he did. And I mean, Adair's translation is substantially longer than the original. And he has all sorts of jokes and things about himself and personal references, so it really is kind of a co-creation. And I understand that completely, that once you've acquired a kind of technique, you feel, A, that you want to, and B, you're sort of licensed to go on and show that you really are doing it like that. And of course, obviously, some people think it's outrageous and that Adair should be stopped. But there we are.
There's a Swiss-German novelist I like, Peter Stamm. I like him quite a bit, and something I've read about him, and I think you mentioned in your book on translation as well, is that he has a very, very stripped-down style, sort of very, very sort of flat linguistically, very sort of basic kind of writing. Very much part of who I perceive him to be as a writer. But there are people who have said that he's almost doing like a pre-translation because he's definitely aware that he's gonna. That if he's easier to get into English, he will have more effect on the sort of global scale, I guess, right? And I wonder if you think about that at all, that there's been this kind of influence because English is such a sort of dominant language, and that's been something you've noticed over the decades, years.
I'm fascinated by that. I mean, there are people like Stephen Owen at Harvard who denounce this in contemporary Chinese writing, that there are some Chinese poets who seem to him to be writing with a view to being translated, and that this is, you know, the bad side of globalization, because it is denaturing and making less authentic everything. Right. And then, you know, I look at Ismail Kadare, who, from a young age, partly because he was a teenage literary star in Albania, partly because he was actually translated from the age of 20 on. I mean, even when he was a student in Moscow, he was being translated into Russian. Kedai, from a young age, feels himself to be in the company of Byron and Shakespeare and Goethe, and these are the guys he talks to in his sleep. You know, he's not really interested in contemporary literature. And all these writers exist for him through the medium of translation. And he imagines himself as existing for the world through the medium of translation, because 3 million readers of Albanian, what's that? You know, the population of Brooklyn, it's not very interesting. Doesn't mean to say he doesn't write, as it were, from and within his own authentic experience of Albania, but for him, literature, the idea of literature for him is of something global, something that does transmit itself between countries and over the ages, and over the centuries. And then you go back to Victor Hugo. I mean, Victor Hugo says, I'm not writing for France, I'm writing for the world. I'm writing about France, but France is the world. And, rather like an English writer now, like, you know. I think the universalizing or transnational impulse at a certain level of literary creation is natural and, well, a part of these overweening literary ambitions. So good for Peter Stamm if it involves him in writing what he doesn't mean or not writing what he does mean, then it's probably a bad idea. But I think if you're Kadare or Hugo or Perec for that matter, I mean, I first read La Vie Moderne for Life User's Manual when I had a bad cold in 1981, and I pretended to have a cold for a bit longer so I could finish the book before going back to it. And I was just bowled over by it because my feeling about it was that this is a book that happened to be written in French, but that was, as it were, in its nature, in its essence, in ambition, a book that could be in any language, more specifically in English, because I could do it in English, and I could share it with my family and other people by doing it into English. And I think not every work, but many works that really matter are of that kind, that they are, it's not just that they are transmissible, it's that they have in them a, they realize a palpable ambition to pass beyond their own particular contexts. So no, I'm not worried. And yes, sure, this century it's English, but you know, last century it was French, and I mean, it was Latin before that, and I mean, it'll move around, and it's not the end of the world if English happens to be the dominant global interlanguage. Though I must say, from what I know, which is not a great deal about the history of language and interaction, the current role of English is probably unprecedented on a global scale. I mean, it reaches further than Latin ever reached. And so we'll see what happens, but linguistic diversity is not going to suddenly collapse just because everybody is learning English. And the pan-European vitality of Latin for over 1,000 years didn't cause French or English or Gaelic to collapse and disappear.
Well, is that a good place to end, or any last questions? Well, thank you so much, David.